afternoon, good morning. Good afternoon, good morning, everyone. My name is Tasha Friday. I am the Assistant Director of the Tribal Youth Resource Center on Wichita, Kiowa, and Caddo from Oklahoma, also Hunka, Oglala, Lakota. So just very glad to have all of your presence here today as we explore compassion fatigue and how we can better take care of our minds, bodies, spirits, and emotions. I know the work that we all do can be draining. So, our hope is that you have some takeaways today that can help you better manage and navigate that, not only for yourself, but in helping your communities to learn some of the things that you take away from here. I'm just so blessed and privileged to have our partners at NNCTC, and with the leadership of Marilyn and Veronica and Nona today. I know that this is going to be a great session. So from the TYRC, we are wishing you wellness and hoping that we provide some much needed information to assist you in the work that you do. Suteets, thank you.
Next slide, please. Good morning, everyone. As you can see, I'm Dr. Marilyn Zimmerman. We're going to start out with an opening to ground ourselves for the training today. So this is the first part of it. I'd like you, if you can, sometimes I know I'm sitting in my chair with my feet up, but if you are willing to sit up as straight as you can and put your feet flat on, both feet flat on the floor. And let's breathe in for 4 seconds and breathe out for 4 seconds and breathe in for 4 seconds and hold for 4 seconds. And then I have a poem that I'd love to share. So breathing in. Breathe out. Breathe in. Breathe out. Excellent. So I'm going to be sharing a poem by Joy Harjo, our National Poet Laureate, and it's called The Eagle Poem. To pray, you open your whole self, to sky, to earth, to sun, to moon, to one whole voice that is you. And know there is more that you can't see, can't hear, can't know except in moments, steadily growing, and in languages that aren't always sound, but other circles of motion. Like eagle that Sunday morning over Salt River, circled in blue sky, in wind, swept our hearts clean with sacred wings. We see you, see ourselves, and know that we must take the utmost care and kindness in all things. Breathe in, knowing that you are made of all this, and breathe knowing that we are truly blessed because we were born and die soon with a true circle of motion. Like eagle rounding out the sky inside of us, we pray that it will be done in beauty, in beauty. Excellent. Next slide, please. Hopefully that centers us to hear some of the information that we're going to hear today. So this morning, we're going to talk about identifying and recognizing some signs of compassion fatigue, maybe a little bit of vicarious trauma and secondary traumatic stress. We're going to look at how we can reduce the occurrences or mitigate some of the symptoms that we experience as we are doing our work in order to sustain us in the work. So many of us leave the profession because we get to a place where we're either burnt out or we're experiencing so much compassion fatigue that we don't feel useful in the field anymore. And then we're going to review and practice some self-care strategies. Please feel free in the chat. And if Antonia, if you could interrupt me, if there's a question in the chat or a comment in the chat, that would be great. And then I won't have to pay attention to the chat. Okay, thank you. Next slide, please. So let's start out on a little positive note. A lot of us get into this work because we care, right? Or we have a vision for what we know our communities can be, our families can be. We we want to be helpers. Maybe we're natural helpers and we go into this profession because that's that's how we identify ourselves. Or we go into this work sometimes with our own trauma histories, but we found ways of coping, and we found ways of post-traumatic growth that we want to bring to the field. So it really is those perceived joys, whatever they might be for you, whatever your motivation is, or whatever really feeds your soul, derived from the experiencing alongside the suffering with others, and being able to be in some way a relief to the way that our youth and our families might be suffering. Next slide, please. But it's almost compassion resilience. Compassion satisfaction is building resilience, but our resilience can erode over time, depending on our workforce, the caseloads that we have, the kinds of families that we are working with, the kinds of environments that we're working in. So we can become stressed or fatigued. So compassion stress is really derived from experiencing the suffering of others and wanting to help relieve in some way. And fatigue is experiencing those short-term exhaustions and traumatic stress reactions associated with exposure to the suffering of others. It's the weariness that comes with caring, and that can be eroded, as I said earlier. And it can be about those experiences of exposure to the suffering of one's clients, but most often it's not necessarily hearing the stories that our youth tell, though those can be heartbreaking, or those can be soul feeding if they share a story of triumph or of resilience. But it's really sometimes having clients whose behaviors are based in a trauma trigger, they've been triggered, or they have a trauma response that aren't helpful in a collaborative relationship when you're there to help restore them to the community, restore them to their families. That is what's often most wearing on those of us that work in the field. Next slide, please. I want to talk a little bit about vicarious trauma. This is what's the word I'm looking for? Comes out of the field of nursing, where it's really this notion that nurses had so little power in their workplace because of administrators and doctors being over them, that they began to take out that frustration, that anger, that fear, that distrust on each other. There was an old saying that the nurses ate their young. In other words, if I have a new nurse on staff, and if I pulled a double, she's going to pull a triple. If I have to, take leave for a week, she's going to take leave for 2 weeks in order to help out them. It's that sort of sideways anger coming out. And that can really be a big piece of the compassion stress and compassion fatigue in a workforce. So it's those instances where you feel undermined. You have colleagues who minimize your contribution. Gossip is a huge indicator of vicarious trauma in the workplace. Backbiting, undermining, as I said, not pulling their own weight because they don't want to or don't have to, that sort of thing. And it's really erodes our ability to have any sort of satisfaction in the workforce. We may be brilliant case managers or brilliant support staff, but if that's happening in the workplace, it can really erode our satisfaction. Next slide, please. So what is secondary traumatic stress, or also known as compassion fatigue in some circles? So it's that natural or consequent behaviors and emotions that we have resulting from knowing about a traumatic incident or event experienced by a significant other. It's the stress resulting from helping or wanting to help somebody who's experienced trauma and is suffering, But again, I want to bring this home. It's not necessarily just the stories. Those are horrible and awful, but it's those unhelpful behaviors. I'm thinking about when I worked in juvenile justice, I'm thinking about the parents who had been triggered and felt incompetent, right? Because their child is in JDC and were so presented as angry, as non-compliant, as belligerent, when maybe it wasn't that. Maybe it was, they're really stressed, they're feeling like they're not a good parent, whatever that might be. So that can have a real consequence by being bombarded by those unhelpful behaviors by parents or adolescents, particularly in juvenile detention, right? They can be triggered so easily in juvenile detention settings that we have to be very careful to guard ourselves and to build our resilience, knowing that it's behavior that's not about me, it's happening in front of me, but it's not about me. Next slide. So we secondary traumatic stress, can be connected to PTSD. So it's really having those, excuse me. Sort of recurrent or re-experiencing the traumatic event. It's, that maybe the adolescent blew up in the juvenile detention center and maybe they made it across the table at you and it was a very fearful experience for you, even though you care about this kid, that you keep sort of re-experiencing. You dream about it, you daydream about it, those sorts of things. So, and it also is having that fearful reaction. What is that? When we, again, am I going to be in a closed environment with a long conference table and how will that make me feel? Anything that actually resembles the environment of the event. We can also get to the place where it's sort of like, I can't do this one more time. I can't walk by there. I can't work in that building. It's those avoidance behaviors that we engage in. A lot of tardiness of workforce, a lot of sick days from staff, a lot of, sloughing off of responsibilities. That can all be related to secondary traumatic stress, leaning more towards PTSD symptoms. Negative changes in cognition, mood, arousal, obviously. I always like to say that cynicism is a hallmark of secondary traumatic stress. So if you find yourself being much more cynical, and watch your humor. So I have a brilliant sense of humor, but I can also be very sarcastic, right? So, and it can sound very cynical. So I have to really watch myself and say, okay, was that funny because it's funny? Or was that more leaning towards the cynical side? How am I feeling today? What are those things? That's how I check myself all of the time. Okay, next slide. So we want to make sure that everybody understands that compassion fatigue or secondary traumatic stress is very different than burnout. Burnout is very much about sort of occupational burnout, is that it's just, I can't do this anymore. I can't work in this environment. I've got nothing left. And some say it's from absorbing the suffering of clients, and that's true too. Again, reminding ourselves it's those hard behaviors. And that's why it's important, I think, that why we have to talk about secondary traumatic stress or compassion fatigue as part of becoming a trauma-informed agency, because it really is sort of a foundational piece of being trauma-informed, is being able to sustain your staff and their well-being and their ability to engage in therapeutic alliances. That doesn't mean you're a therapist, just that with their clients. So you want to help avoid that at all possible. Psychological is that long-term exhaustion, right? The diminished interest that can often be corrected by changing work settings or changing clients. So being I think supervisors have to be really aware of what their staff are telling them about how they're working with particular clients. Sometimes it's, sometimes there is a client that we really do struggle with, and we need some supervision supports, but we also might need supports from our colleagues. Next slide, please. So how do you get exposed, right? So here's some of the direct and indirect sources for compassion fatigue or secondary traumatic stress. Hearing about traumatic events, particularly if you have a history yourself. I worked with a colleague who did therapy with sexual abuse perpetrators. And he did really well until he worked with a client, because he'd also had a big caseload, who had two little girls that he perpetrated on that were the same age as my friend's daughters. So just hearing about it, he was over the top. Comforting youth whose loved one has died, thinking about the grief and loss in our own lives, listening to tales of domestic violence, the kinds of reactions that we have, that we want to be very protective of our clients. We may become very angry at the perpetrator. Having to say, you're going to take him home, right? Or you're going to take her home, knowing that they're not going to be safe in that place, knowing that they're probably going to be back in the detention center any minute, right? As soon as they go home, they're going to blow out of that household. They're going to be before the judge and they're going to be back in detention. Hearing about how a youth was maybe beaten up by a group of boys or was killed in a car wreck can be very, very traumatic. Witnessing violence between peers. So thinking about particularly detention workers or law enforcement, or even after school programming for tribes where, everybody's not playing nice in the sandbox together. And so they react, they're triggered, and they become violent with one another. Next slide. So who's vulnerable, right? Am I vulnerable? Are you? And does that mean I'm weak? Does that mean that I just don't have what it takes to be a detention worker, what it takes to be a law enforcement officer, what it takes to be a caseworker, parole officer, whatever that might be, however we're working with our youth? No, we don't have to be tough. But what makes us vulnerable is that we are empathetic. I know so many times, I can't tell you how many times I've heard a law enforcement officer, a detention worker, a parole officer, or a social worker talk about their own experiences in their adolescence and how they wanted to be different and make a difference in the lives of the children in their community. So you're empathetic. That puts you at risk. You've experienced them yourselves, as I just described. So you can, that you might not have resolved it. And so it might activate in you sort of the same sort of kinds of pains or trauma that you experience as a child hearing about others. Obviously, listening to those stories can be very painful, especially when we begin to feel a little helpless and hopeless about the situation for that adolescent. And then what makes us vulnerable is that we often neglect our own needs and don't recognize our own needs and the work that we do. And so that can make us vulnerable also. Like, I need to rest. I need to eat. No, I can't take that other shift. I need to take time away to be valuable to my clients. Next slide. So there's not much by way of research, particularly around secondary traumatic stress in Indian country, but we do know that there have been many studies and reports that talk about the higher rates of exposure to violence in Indian country. American Indian children are more likely than any other race to experience violence, both in their households and in their communities. So again, if we're working in our own tribal communities among American Indian adolescents and their families, we have to know that we're working with people who have experienced trauma, and that their reactions and their behaviors are going to reflect that trauma. Next slide. Other factors that we have to think about, again, I'm thinking about my own small tribal community. Almost all of us were, of course, tribal members, but often we had kinship ties, right? It can be helpful in one way. You can frame it as if these are all our relatives. And so How would I want my 15-year-old to be treated? How would I want my grandma to be treated? That's how I'm going to treat this 15-year-old or this grandma, right? Or this mom who's 35 and struggling so much with parenting. But that sometimes that's not how we do it. Sometimes it's too much because it's as if we're feeling the pain of our relatives that are close to us all of the time. And we never escape it, right? It's not like I live in Missoula, Montana right now. It's the community where the University of Montana is. And I was a case manager here in this community, and I could go home and I would probably never see any of my clients over the weekend for months, right? I would go and I went to places, to grocery stores and restaurants or movie theaters where my clients weren't necessarily accessing. But in our tribal communities, we go to the grocery store, we see our relatives, right? We go to the post office, there they are. We go to a basketball game, there's the family, and we know what we know, right? And it can be very, very overwhelming and difficult because there's no place to escape. Next slide. Also remembering that we have very few resources, right? We're constantly thinking about where can I get resources for this kid? Transportation for a kid who needs a psych evaluation is one of the hardest things that I've ever had to deal with in my rural community. It's like he needs to get evaluated tonight, not next Tuesday. This is Thursday. Tonight. He needs, I mean, it's an emergency situation, but there's no transportation. So that can really contribute to our secondary traumatic stress. Because of the high rates of stress, there's high caseloads. We have experienced so much of high rates of trauma because we have so much exposure to. And then again, we have to acknowledge in our tribal communities that historical trauma plays a role in the ongoing contemporary traumas that our clients and our families and our relatives experience. Next slide. So here's how to check yourself. Here's some symptoms to look what it looks like. Maybe you'll recognize yourself in some of these symptoms. Okay, next slide. Some physical symptoms. Sleeping difficulties, a huge. Impaired immune system. Again, it might not be burnout. It might be that your immune system is compromised, so you catch every cold, flu, tummy, whatever that goes around the community, and so you're out a lot. Breathing difficulties, upset stomach. Where do I feel my stress? I feel it up in my neck and my shoulders. I can tell I'm stressed when I am like this in a meeting or in a situation, and all of a sudden I have to go shoulders down. I just start to tighten up. Emotionally, we can have a lot of anxiety in the work that we do. We can have feelings of helplessness or powerlessness. We can feel overwhelmed. We can either minimize our own reactions, minimize the value of our colleagues, minimize the needs of our clients, right? She'll be okay. They all do it anyway. I talked with one tribal judge once. It's like, oh, Marilyn, don't worry about them. They're exposed to violence all the time. They're used to it. Now we know through science and research that no, they're not used to it, that they are experienced trauma at extremely high rates that are impacting their well-being, particularly their educational outcomes. Behaviorally, notice if you have any self-destructive coping behaviors, like drinking too much alcohol, using drugs, going to the casino too often and losing too much money, that sort of thing. But also think about changes in your appetite. There's this withdrawal, right? We're out in the community, we're seeing our clients, we're doing all of that. I think I just want to go home, sit on the couch and watch Netflix for the next 4 days, right? And we can even be accident prone. Next slide. We can have some cognitive issues, we really can. So diminished concentration, lots of forgetfulness, self-doubt, like, did I do everything I could have? You know how when you're on all, firing on all cylinders, and it's just like, yes, I'm getting this done, I'm feeling good, and I'm feeling, like I'm making a difference. And then all of a sudden you're like, should I have done more? Should I have done it this way? I wonder if I should have reached out to mom first or dad first instead of mom, even though he's in the household with mom. Those sorts, we start to second guess ourselves, or we become really rigid. It's black or white. It's like, they need to do this, or these are the consequences, right? There's no room for dialogue. There's no room for alternatives for your client or their family. And we see a lot of trauma injury. Also, if you, I did not know that this was a trauma reaction way back when I knew nothing about trauma. But I would go, remember video stores? Those little local video stores in our little rural reservation communities where it was either attached to a cafe or a gas station or whatever, and you'd go in and you'd get videos and you'd have to rent them and bring them back by the time. Okay, I remember being once, and there was a young couple with small children, and they had a stack of videos, and they were all horror movies, like Last House on the Left, Friday the 13th. I don't even know them. But a whole stack. And I was like, my God, who could do that? Why that? And I did not realize that when you have experienced a lot of trauma, in order to cope, you kind of shut down. And so to be entertained or feel something, you have to go over the top, right? So I did not know that that was a trauma response. That was very interesting though. We begin to isolate ourselves interpersonally. We begin to blame others. We blame the boss, we blame the tribal executive board, and we blame the system, or we blame whoever, the judge. And sometimes there might be truth in some of the things that we sort of, well, if it wasn't for, there might be some truth in that, but we have to understand that if we have no control over it, blaming others isn't going to be very helpful to us. Our relationships begin to deteriorate, particularly our collegial relationships in the workplace. And then again, decreased interest in intimacy or physical touch with a partner or your family. Spiritually, we get impacted, particularly around this loss of purpose. We can get to a place, if we don't do really good self-care, we can get to a place where we don't feel like what I do doesn't make a difference and it doesn't matter. We can become angry with a particularly hard case, with why did you let this happen to this family? I can't understand why the creator of the universe, who cares about us and everything that I've been taught, why it could happen. We begin to question our religious and spiritual beliefs and even the meaning of life. Next slide, please. So professional impacts of our secondary traumatic stress, not just personal impacts, but professional, is, again, reduced performance with our job tasks. I hesitate to say this because I know everybody that has to write case notes, they're like, oh, a burden. They're the worst thing that I have to do. They're so tedious, and there's so many of them, and I'm always behind. But we have to do them, right? So measure that one, a little bit with some compassion for yourself. I get that high caseloads and report writing is hard. The morale, not just your morale, but the morale of your office. If everybody seems angry at everyone all the time, I like to think about the eye rolling, or the eye rolling and the backbiting, that is an indicator of morale. And so supervisors and other staff members have to be really cognizant of it. Interpersonal relationships, I think we hit that one. Behavioral issues among staff that aren't helpful, right? I like to say that a lot. And our attitudes. We don't have to be Pollyanna. No one's expecting us to be Pollyanna. It's like, oh gosh, I'm so excited. I get to work with this family who, left their baby alone for 6 hours with no no changes and no food. No, we're not talking about that with attitude. It's just having an attitude that, I make a difference. I'm going to make a difference in this family. What I do is important. What we do as a team is important. What this agency does for this community is important. It's about that's much more about the attitude. Next slide. All right, now I'm going to pass it to Nona, who will begin the next part of this presentation. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Marilyn. So I'm going to be going over just some more interactive slides with you all. And if you have a pen and paper with you, that's awesome. But if not, you can just, think about it in your mind. But for this one, so Marilyn talked about stress and where she feels it in her body. So this is just a diagram that shows how stress can potentially affect us physically, and we may not even realize it. But when we're feeling stressed or something is really bothering us, or it's a continual stressor in your life, maybe that's the work, some of the work that you do, or maybe some of the situations that you deal with, that can create stress in our bodies and we may not even realize it. So this is where being conscious of our bodies can come in really handy, because oftentimes when we're feeling stressed, we tense up. Like for me, I feel a lot of my stress in my shoulders and my neck, and I tend to sit there in tension without realizing it. And so feel free, if you want to, you don't have to participate, but if you would all take a moment to think about when you're feeling stressed out, where you feel it in your body. It could be something that causes aches. If you're feeling achy anywhere in your body, maybe you get headaches, or your stomach, maybe you get knots in your stomach, or maybe you experience sweating, continual sweating if you're in a stressful situation. It could be aches anywhere in your body. It could be your shoulders, it could be your neck, it could be your legs. So if you would take a few seconds and just think about that for yourself and where you seem to experience stress, and then just put it in the chat. Stress headaches, neck and shoulders, neck and shoulders. A lot of shoulders and upper back. Insomnia, yeah, that was something that we may not think of that's related to stress. If you're an overthinker and you lay there in bed at night thinking about this and that, we'll talk about how maybe to help with that here in a bit. Hips, lots of neck and shoulders. And so that could be because we sit there, when we're in stressful situations, we sit tense. So being mindful of your body, being body aware, when you're either at work or whatever situation is causing you stress, and kind of going from head to toe, where am I holding my tension? Am I feeling tense right now? And then just releasing your muscles, where you're feeling tense at. If you tend to tighten your jaw, sometimes we'll tighten our jaws without realizing it. So that could be just a way from head to toe. If you're feeling stressed out anytime, whether it's personal or professional, that could be a way for you to release some of that tension and just do that breathing exercise that Marilyn did in the beginning. That could be something too that could help with that. Excuse me. If you can go to the next slide, please. Thank you all for participating also. I appreciate it. So this one is sort of like a pie chart. This is something that you can do anytime if you're thinking about wanting to create a self-care plan. So because we may be seeing things, witnessing things, and attempting to help those suffering from trauma, our worldviews can sometimes undergo alterations. Sometimes they're obvious, sometimes they're subtle. We can start to form new ways of thinking about the world, ourselves, our relationships, and how others might see us. And as a result, we may experience disruptions in our physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual balance. And we may not even realize it. So this is where we're giving you some tools that you could utilize anytime you're feeling like you may be out of balance, to just think about what may be out of balance and how to bring it back into balance. And we can be impacted negatively or positively by our work, and there's no shame and nothing pathological about being impacted negatively. It's just the nature of some of the work that we do. And when we're in helping professions, that's something that happens because we sometimes see a lot of trauma in some of the positions that we're in. So if we'll take a few minutes, and you can put it in the chat, you could do like one per area: physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual. But we'll do a few responses to a few questions that might help us determine whether and how our work might be affecting our ways of thinking about the world. And don't worry about your answers being positive or negative or somewhere in between. It's just whatever comes to mind. And the purpose of this exercise is just self-awareness again, but more so about how we're feeling, our thoughts and stuff. So we talked about the physical part. Now we're talking about internally. And if we do discover that we've developed some negative ways of thinking, we can all identify alternative ways of thinking that challenge these negative ways. So interrupting those negative thoughts and that negative thought process, because we may start doing that and not even realize it. And that's just a result of compassion fatigue or secondary trauma. So the first question, and just put it in the chat if you feel comfortable. If not, you can write it down, or if you're on your computer and are able to type, you can type it on your computer. But the first question is, how has my work impacted how I see the world? And an example for that one could be the future of our youth is at risk, or on the positive spin is that the world is full of resilience. So those are just examples. So how has my work impacted how I see the world? And you can put it in the chat if you feel comfortable sharing. I'm much more cautious and at times much more concerned for youth. So more conscious of maybe how we interact with people or the youth that we're working with. Sometimes people just need an opportunity to flourish. Awesome. I think there's so many more barriers in today than 2 years ago. Is that kind of thinking pandemic wise, like the pandemic has caused more barriers maybe? I find myself being concerned for the safety of my grandchildren. I think that's a natural response for sure. So this is something that just helps us think about, where we're at with a lot of this stuff. And so thank you guys for that. And then the next question, how has my work impacted my relationships? So an example might be loss of trust, or on the opposite side, feelings of luck and gratitude to have loving relationships with one's own children. So how has my work impacted my relationships? Martina says, I just noticed the other day that I mostly had negative thoughts and working to change to positive thinking. Yes, yeah. So interrupting negative thoughts, definitely. And I think it's just a natural response to some of the things that we experience and see in our work that we do. Rochelle says that she feels closer to her coworkers. Yeah, sometimes the work that we do, it just creates this sort of second family because of the things that we see and experience, and that's great to have a great support system within your where you're working at too, especially if the work that you're doing can be traumatizing. Tresha said, I think I offer my help and resources more freely to people I meet after working with youth and families for years. That's awesome. Okay, and then the third question, how has my work impacted how I see myself or how others see me? So an example of that might be, this is an example that something someone might say. Since I started this work, my husband has noticed I'm more distant, or since I have started this work, I have learned that I can be persistent. So how has my work impacted how I see myself or how others see me? Emily said, I find that once I am off the clock, I can't talk to anyone for at least a couple of hours. I need time to just sit in the quiet and process. And that's a great self-awareness. Because I think when we aren't aware of that and we do need that time, that we can maybe become irritable and agitated, especially to the people we love, you know, our families. So being conscious of that is a great self-awareness. Extended family tend to reach out to me day or night. Oh, so that can sometimes create more stress. So sometimes when we are in crisis situations, I see who I can rely on, trust to help me solve problems. Awesome, thank you. And then the last question, how has my work disrupted or altered my sense of balance? So an example might be questioning the existence of a higher power, or on the other side, feeling more spiritually connected than previously. So how has my work disrupted or altered my sense of balance? Rochelle said, the information I bring to tribal court is so important, and I'm blessed that I am trusted to do that. That's awesome. And then the final question, really quick, and then we'll move to the next slide. How has my work disrupted or altered my sense of balance? Tresha said she prays more. That's awesome. Cheryl says, I have become more balanced. That's good. Okay, I am snacking more. As a result of working in this field, I find that balance is not only the goal, but the only place of real resolution and peace for parties. Yes, if we're doing this work that can be traumatizing and some of the things that we see, definitely finding a way to balance your personal life and your personal well-being. Emily said, I make more of an effort to balance my work and personal life, and I'm encouraged to do it by my supervisors. Yes, yes, yeah. Okay. Martina says, I go out and pray in nature. I self-check myself. That's where I find my balance too, is out in nature. I really love being in the mountains. It's so quiet. Don't have to worry about anything out there. Okay, thank you all for participating in that. And we will go to the next slide, please. So we'll talk a little bit about Zen, and you may be familiar with Zen and you may not be, but Zen is just a sense of balance, feeling at peace. So what are the indicators that I'm doing well? How am I physically, emotionally, relationally, behaviorally, and cognitively? And so physical, an example of being physically Zen would be well-groomed, eating fruits and vegetables, drinking water, and feeling rested. And drinking water can cause even more stress if we're not drinking water. So like, you know, how we talked about feeling stress in our bodies. If we're getting headaches, it might be because also that we're not drinking enough water. So just thinking of how all of these can affect our physical well-being also. Emotionally Zen is being able to experience peace and joy, tolerance for obstacles, or upsetting situations. So being able to handle those really stressful moments and not, you know, flying off the handle if something happens that is overwhelming. Relationally Zen, being patient with your children or your family or your partner, joking around, playful, wanting to spend time and checking in with friends. Behaviorally, exercising, and that doesn't have to be, you know, going for a run or HIIT workouts or Insanity, if you're familiar with insanity, it could just be going for a walk. Someone mentioned that they like to go out in nature. So that could be exercise, walking, if you have access to somewhere like that, or walking in the park, or just going for a walk in your neighborhood. And you're sleeping well, variety of activity. So having different activities or hobbies that you enjoy. And mental Zen is thinking positively about yourself, your coworkers, and your clients. And I know that, we may not always feel this way all the time, and that's okay. But this is a way to check in with yourself of how you might be feeling in that moment, or day to day, moment to moment in each day. And next slide, please. So increasing self-care, this might be, these are examples of when you might need to be more conscious of your self-care activities. So physically, if you're drinking more caffeine or you feel tired, you're less concerned about your appearance, or you feel like you're wasting energy, that could be a sign that you are experiencing compassion fatigue and need to focus more on your self-care strategies. Emotionally, if you're fretting or feeling more anxious, less tolerance and feeling agitated. Relationally, less playful with your family, less tolerance for others' flaws. So if you're feeling more irritable, behaviorally not making as much time to exercise, skipping me time, tugging at your hair, or less productive. So any kind of fidgety kind of things that you might do when you're stressed out, if you're noticing that more, that could be a sign that you need to focus more on self. And mentally, all or nothing Nancy popping up. So all or nothing Nancy is, it's either one way or no way. There's no gray area. There's no room for, flexibility. So that could be a sign also that maybe you need to focus on some self-care time for you, whatever that looks like. It could be reading a book. It could be sitting quietly for a couple of hours, like someone mentioned. Like an example could also be in the morning, I like to drink coffee in quiet by myself. That's like one of my things that I look forward to every day. So something like that you enjoy just for you. Next slide, please. So this is examples of what it would look like if you're just completely stressed out and you need to just take a chill pill and focus on you. This would be a time maybe to step away, like take 20 minutes and go hang out outside or in your room or wherever your safe space is at. These would be signs that you need to really focus on self. So lack of sleep, lack of energy, seeking out caffeine and sugary snacks, wondering frantically about if you're just like all over the place at home or at work. Emotionally, hostility, anger, panic, overwhelmed. Relationally, if you're withdrawing from family, if you just don't feel like being around your family, that is a sure sign that you might be experiencing some burnout. Being short with others, not spending time with friends or whoever you socialize with. Behaviorally, not exercising at all or finding ways to relax. Unable to accomplish tasks. Mentally, obsessing over details, self-disparaging thoughts, negative thoughts towards others. So these are just examples that show the levels of which we may be experiencing, leading towards burnout or experiencing compassion fatigue from the work that we do. And so this is just to give you an idea that maybe if you're experiencing some of these, it might be time to start focusing on some self-care stuff. Next slide, please. So this is just a diagram to show how our well-being is all connected. Oftentimes we don't relate all of these things together. And our well-being, our approaches is more holistic. It can be more holistic if that is how you view well-being. So just to go through the circles, spiritual, cultural, so communal, like if you're very connected with your family, your community, that could be a way that you would practice self-care also. Social, mental, emotional, physical. And so they're all related. Every single one of these is related. And this next slide, this is just to show you what that looks like. But for this next slide, so this is you can take a picture of this or make a diagram really quick if you want. But this is what you would use to think of positive activities that you could do or positive things for each part of those circles of what you could do for a self-care plan. So cultural, what does that look like for you? What would be an activity that would help you culturally feel more balanced? Socially, what would you do socially that would help you feel more balanced, less stressed out? Mentally, what would that look like for you? Would that be journaling, or maybe you access therapy, or maybe just spending time with friends? That could cover two of those, mental and social. To just have a vent session with your friends if that's something that they would welcome for you, or visiting grandparents. That could cover emotional too. What is that going to look like for you? Physical, what is your physical activity that you do that helps you feel balanced? Going for a walk, going for a run, working out, going on a hike if you like to hike, riding a bike, anything physical that helps you feel more at balance or gets out all that stress. I know sometimes when I'm feeling really stressed, I just have the urge to run. So I'll go run and I can punch out like 2 miles and then feel fine. Spiritual, and what does that look like for you spiritually? Do you practice, traditional, your traditional cultural ways, or is it going to church, or is it going to a social dance, or something? Whatever your spiritual how you tend to your spiritual well-being, what does that look like? So this is just something that you could utilize. And if you have a phone, you can take a picture of it and then write it down, later, and just use this every so often to think about what you could do for each one of those circles for yourself to help feel more balanced. Next slide, please. So considerations for selecting strategies for self-care. Thinking of time. So in the moment, if you're experiencing something in the moment where you're feeling really stressed out, what could you do in that moment? You could use that breathing exercise that was in the beginning to just let it go, breathe in, breathe out, catch your breath, and then refocus on what you're doing. And then we're going to do another activity at the end of this training that you could utilize too. It's a grounding activity. And then long-term, what are your long-term strategies for self-care? It could be utilizing that diagram that we just showed you to think about, what could I do every day, or what could I do at least once a week or twice a week to make sure that I'm taking care of myself. And then the arenas of self-care strategies are your personal. So your personal self-care strategies what does that look like? Reading a book, going for a walk, taking time to pray every morning and at night, or throughout the day if you need to. Professional, making sure that your calendars are up to date and that you're staying on top of your tasks. What do you use for yourself to make sure that you're professionally staying on top of things, your professional self-care. And then organizationally, within the place that you work, what sort of organizational self-care, team care strategies are in place. And that could be weekly check-ins with your supervisor, or that could be team check-ins with your whole team, or that could be having a lunch and learn with your team each week or something like that. So just thinking of all of these different strategies that you could do for each part of your life, and keeping a flexible revolving door approach to the types of activities you choose, because maybe you don't feel like going for a run or going for a walk. So what could you do in place of that to make sure that you're still taking care of yourself? Next slide, please. So this is an activity that if we were in person, we would be giving you pieces of paper to create your own plate of self-care. So this is kind of just another activity that you could use for yourself that's similar to the circle activity that we just showed you, the circle diagram. And then this one, it just gives you each part of your life like a pie. So what's on your plate? You know, let's see here. So as a educator, whatever your role is, a community member or a family member, you're in a caregiving role. And it's a normal reaction to feeling overwhelmed or overcommitted. Like someone said earlier that they, their family or friends call them day and night, like all the time. So that could make someone feel overwhelmed and overcommitted. And your ability to respond to or support can be compromised if you know, if we're doing too much or taking on too much. So with the self-care, this is where you would stick in your own, because there's no wedge in here for self-care. So where would you stick the self-care wedges within this diagram here to make sure that you're still, you know, fulfilling what you need to fulfill, but also making sure that you're thinking about yourself and taking care of yourself so that you can take care of others. Because if we're constantly caring for others without filling our cup, without taking care of ourselves, that can lead to burnout and compassion fatigue. And so this is just an example of, you know, if you're a visual learner or a hands-on learner, this would be a great activity that you could utilize to focus on yourself, to give you a visual of where could you put self-care time in with the work part, with the work wedge. Where could you put self-care time in that? Is it lunchtime where you go for a short walk? Or do some breathing exercises, mindfulness, family time? What does your self-care time look like in that? Exercise, your spiritual and cultural, and then sleep. Okay, next slide, please. So acknowledging challenges, making time when all others around you seem to need your help. And I know that can feel hard sometimes, making, you know, drawing boundaries, but with the work that the work that we do sometimes, we have to figure out boundaries to make sure that we're not overdoing it or causing ourselves more stress by trying to take on everything. Feelings of guilt and shame for taking care of yourself. And this is common. And I even struggle with it sometimes. I'm a new empty nester. My son is in his first year of college. So being able to think about just myself has been not a challenge, but it's been different. So this is a common reaction to self-care because we're so used to being caregivers, right? Especially with not just our families, but in the work that we do because of it's a serving profession, professions that we are in. But it's a way to make sure that you're taking care of yourself. Believing those around you are doing fine, so you should be too. Lack of modeling. So if we didn't have modeling of self-care growing up, then we may not have that as a tool either. Lack of support. Maybe you don't have the kind of support that you need to practice some of these self-care strategies. But how could we alleviate that? Or what are some ways that are doable and reachable to help support ourselves with self-care? And then systemic and structural barriers. Sometimes in our communities, especially if they're rural, we don't have access to certain modalities. So like therapy, if that's something that is not accessible in your community, what could we do? What could we think of to maybe fulfill that? Maybe it's support groups, or if there's telehealth available, how could we set that up for people in the community to utilize therapy through telehealth? Things like that. And so these are some of the challenges that have come up, that do come up, and that are very real. And so just being conscious of that and not get discouraged. Next slide, please. And so make a commitment, advocate for your well-being as part of your professional development, making sure that this is part of your workplace organizationally. And if it isn't, beginning to think about how could you implement that? How could you start it within your organization to make sure that personal well-being is valued as well as professional well-being. Recognizing the effort you make to take care of yourself. Continue to monitor your stress. Remember, I said just head to toe, where am I feeling stressed? And then releasing that tension if you're feeling tension anywhere in your body. That could be a way to alleviate some of the pain that we get from feeling tense. Make it part of your daily routine. If prayer is something that you do, make sure you're doing that every morning if that helps you feel less stressed. Or if you practice smudging is a great way to start your day off with. I know it sets the tone for my day when I'm able to make sure that I do that. Find an accountability buddy. If you have a buddy or a coworker that maybe wants to jump on board and hold each other accountable to make sure you're taking care of yourself, then do that. I think that's a great way to hold yourself accountable, but also have someone else holding you accountable. And encourage sharing of strategies. So if you are aware of tools, share them. But if others, maybe ask others, your teammate, maybe that's a teamwork activity to do at work, sharing strategies for self-care. Or maybe it's something you guys all do together at lunchtime or something like that. Okay, next slide, please. So managing survival mode. I think we've probably all been in this mode and sometimes we're not even aware of it. And being in survival mode, going into survival mode, it's extremely useful in emergency situations. It turns on very quickly and sometimes we don't even realize it. And it takes over all of our mental and bodily functions, orienting us and protecting us from the perceived threat. In non-emergency situations, however, survival mode can be maladaptive, so it can become not useful. It can be turned on in response to situations that are upsetting, but that do not threaten us with direct harm. This is especially common among people who work in a crisis-driven environment. So if you work in a very stressful job or some of the work that you do can be very traumatizing, this is something that can be quickly activated without us even realizing it. And it can persist, not switching itself off with anywhere near the same ease with which it was activated. And repeated experiences like this have a cumulative negative impact. So this is where we could really start feeling it in our bodies. The feeling tired, not eating when we're supposed to, things like that. We can manage survival mode though, so that it's less harmful. We can do this by cultivating the skills and knowledge to become aware of, monitor and control its activation. And we must develop an awareness of what triggers the activation of survival mode on us. And we must learn how prolonged activation and work-related stressors, particularly how they impact our bodies, feelings, thoughts, and social behaviors. So what we talked about in these last slides, and then what Marilyn talked about, those are some of the things that can indicate that we may be in survival mode or going into survival mode or like consistently in survival mode. And the symptoms of that, what we talked about, what Marilyn talked about, what I just mentioned, are indicators of where you might be with that. Next slide, please. So strategies to reduce stress. What is a coping strategy? Process of managing stressful situations, deliberate and planned approach. And the goal is to reduce, tolerate, or minimize stress. And making sure that you're thinking about your own individualized plan to how it works for you. And using those diagrams that we shared could be a great tool to do that, making sure that you're covering every part of your life, not just one, and incorporating your self-care strategies into those for yourself to address anything that might be happening in your life. And create a coping strategies toolbox. So these coping strategies that we've talked about, the one in the beginning with breathing, this one we'll do at the end, those diagrams that we showed you, those are all tools that you could use to figure out what works best for me in these stressful situations that you might be dealing with. Harmful coping strategies, like using drugs and alcohol, might seem better at first because it may numb feelings or stress, and that's sometimes why people turn to them. And they may feel okay in the beginning, but in the long run, they can create a dependence and a lot of other problems. Alcohol is a depressant, and so if we're already feeling stressed out or depressed about something, it's going to create more depressed feeling that's not going to improve anything. And so just keeping that in mind. Healthy coping strategies help to decrease stress hormones too, because when we're stressed, our body releases hormones that can keep us, it's the survival mode deal. But healthy coping strategies can calm our minds and create healthy bodies. Healthy coping strategies can help us deal with everyday difficult situations, and they can also help to mitigate against the impact of compassion fatigue or secondary trauma. Next slide, please. So what's most important to keep in mind as our goal is to do our best to not only survive despite adversity, but to do all we can to thrive despite adversity or anything that we might be dealing with at work. In order to do this, we must really practice what we're preaching here today and put our professional as well as our personal self-care above all else and foremost. And remember, I mentioned that you might feel guilty and you might feel shame, and that's a normal response. But in order to do the work that we do, to make sure that you're also okay personally, self-care is super important so that you don't experience burnout. Because when we get to the burnout stage, that is a point where it can be, you may keep doing the work or you may not and switch to something else. And so this is really important to make sure that you're focusing on your self-care. And research indicates that employers who maintain and encourage overall health and well-being for their workforce typically reach higher levels of productivity and job satisfaction. So it also contributes to the overall health of the place that you work, the work that you're doing. In the helping professions, there's a harmful stereotype of the effective worker as someone who has a superhuman level of toughness. And Marilyn kind of talked about that earlier. The work is meant to be difficult according to this stereotype, and we either learn to deal with it or we're defeated by it. And the line of reasoning does a disservice to those of us who are, we're all human, and it can put our organization in a bind if we don't get away from that sort of approach. In reality, our work is extremely difficult at times, and none of us are prepared to meet all of the challenges, emotional, physical, personal, and spiritual, that it can present to us, but we can improve our ability to do so. We can mitigate the effects of burnout and compassion fatigue by practicing self-care. So again, making sure that self-care is one of your priorities. And it means not only holding ourselves responsible for the parts of our job we can control, it means finding ways of maintaining a positive attitude in the face of professional challenges. Next slide, please. So self-care also means engaging in activities that we find fun, distracting, fulfilling, relaxing, that keep us physically and spiritually healthy. And that allow us to achieve personal growth and connection with others. By deliberately and consistently practicing self-care, you will better be able to help the children that you serve. It can also help you be the spouse, parent, family member, friend, and human being you want to be. And it's also, like I said, it's a necessity to practice self-care, to make sure that you're doing self-care. It shouldn't be a perk, or it shouldn't be a luxury. It should just be part of your everyday routine to make sure that you're okay and you're doing good. So prioritizing self-care and finding forms of that to best support you in your work is key to making sure that you can do the best in your job. Next slide, please. The ABCs of self-care. So we'll go through these just to give you an idea of what they are. So self-care is not an emergency management or crisis response strategy. By the time we find ourselves in any sort of emergency, emotional, physical, personal, or spiritual, as a result of compassion fatigue or burnout, we may need more than self-care to help us to return to health and well-being. So that's why we need to consistently make sure that we're staying on top of our self-care, because getting to burnout stage can be really harmful to our overall well-being. And so building self-care routines into everyday work and home lives. Many of you may already be stretched very thin at work and home, but try not to think of self-care in a way that is placing like another thing to do on your list. Try to think of it as a way to, okay, how is this is going to release some of the stress that I'm feeling. If I do this, I'm going to feel a little bit better. If I go for a run, I'm not going to feel as stressed out. If I go out and go for a walk in nature, I'm not going to feel as stressed out. I'm going to feel more at peace. So remembering why we're doing that to help us feel better in healthy ways. And this is one of the most widely accepted frameworks for thinking about self-care and for mitigating vicarious trauma or secondary trauma. And so we'll go through each one, A, B, and C: awareness, balance, and connection. You go to the next slide, please. So awareness, A stands for awareness. We cannot know how to cope with stress if we aren't sure whether or how we might be affected by it. Some of what we've covered so far has likely led you down the path to more awareness of how your work might be affecting you. And while I hope that some of what we've shared has served this purpose, true awareness depends on you. So being self-aware, you are the world's only expert on your own stress levels, your own traumatic memories or things that you experience, personal relationships, professional functioning, and physical and spiritual well-being. Developing greater awareness of these aspects in your life is the first step toward preventing and mitigating toxic stress. So making sure that we're building our awareness. And so a lot of what we talked about today is meant to do that. Next slide, please. So B stands for balance. Proper self-care depends on finding and maintaining a balance between the various parts of your life. And that can be the challenge, but often our work squeezes out other parts of our lives. This can happen because we're no longer working, or because we're working longer hours than is healthy for us. But it can also happen when we're working regular hours, but cannot stop thinking or talking about work at night and on the weekends. So bringing work home with us and not being able to check out can cause, things to feel out of balance. And though we might be feeling we're being productive in these situations, in reality, we are at our most productive and least likely to burn out when we balance our work activities with personal and family life, leisure activities, making sure we're getting sleep and relaxation time. So keeping that balance, making sure that we're not going to contribute to our burnout. Next slide, please. So C is for connection. Connection can refer to relationships, to community, to spiritual matters, and it dictates, self-care dictates that we seek out and maintain positive connections in these realms, both at work and in our lives outside of work. So maintaining positive connections. And sometimes that might be hard, especially if we're working in a community where there may be lots of trauma. That constant negative thought process can be present in whole communities. So being conscious of that and making sure that you're setting boundaries with that too, so that you're not internalizing that negativity, interrupting that negative thought process. And so with that, I will turn it over to Veronica to take us through the rest of the slides.
Thanks, Nona. Next slide, please. So we have 15 minutes left, and I just wanted to give an example of a self-care plan, just to kind of show you what that might look like and share some more strategies that might be helpful to you. So this is just an example of a personal self-care plan. Next slide. So, and as Nona mentioned, there are some things that we can do in the moment, and then there's also some things that we can do long-term. So when it comes to spiritual and cultural strategies, some of the things that we might be able to do in the moment is, as mentioned before, stepping outside. It could be reading something inspirational to us. More long-term, it could be learning our languages. It could be being a part of a spiritual community that we worship together or we pray together with others. Next slide, please. So we've already talked about prayer, and songs is another example. These are just some quick in the moment things that we can do to help us if we're struggling with stress. I know for me personally, like prayer is something that I try to use because it feels like I'm unburdening myself of the stress. And so that's something that can be helpful. And even just listening to songs that uplift us, they can be healing songs, or they can just be songs that just put us in a good mood, round dance songs or any other type of songs that can encourage us and uplift our spirits. Next slide, please. We can also turn to some medicinal plants that we're familiar with or learn more about them in our area. I know for me personally, I'm struggling with a cold right now, if you can't tell by my voice. And so, one of the things that I've learned growing up is to use sage, to boil it and to drink it, and to use the steam from it to help with the sickness. I've also, been taught about the medicinal properties of a plant that we use that we call Navajo tea that kind of helps with that too. So maybe there's, I know for my tribe, people, we use corn pollen to pray. And so there's just different things that maybe in your area and for you personally that are effective for you and helpful to you. Next slide, please. So other examples can be, as Nona mentioned, just connecting yourself to the land. I know for myself, I was taught about the 4 sacred mountains to the Dene people. And this is a picture of our mountain to the east, Cisnagini, Blanca Peak in Colorado. And so we are just taught about the power of these mountains and what they mean to our people, and being able to go to those sacred places that mean a lot to us is one way that can help us return to balance when we're feeling the toxic stress overwhelming us. Another way is just through our language. Sometimes with English, things just fall flat for us, especially if we grew up learning our language or hearing our language, that sometimes it's just that phrase in our own language, that saying that is meaningful to us and encourages us. So this is just one example of a phrase when I was growing up that really helped me, which is "Ahwa ajit ego," and it's basically just encouraging us to to take the initiative and to that we can do it, that we have the power to do something. So that's kind of what I've learned growing up. So maybe similarly, there's some things in your language that is encouraging to you, phrases that may be encouraging to you, that when you say them to yourself, they really uplift you. Next slide, please. Similarly, stories in our cultures that may be empowering to us and helpful to us. For me, growing up, I learned about the story of the hero twins, and these twins of these sons of changing women that were journeyed to the sun, their father, and they were, given these tools to come back and protect themselves as well as protect others, and protect the people from these monsters that were harming us. So that's a story that I often turn to just for encouragement, to help me think about just the resiliency of our people, how it originated with these hero twins, and still continues today as an example of how how resilient we are as a people. Next slide, please. So social strategies, Nona already mentioned some of them, but things that we can do in the moment, maybe there's just that one friend, that one cousin, maybe it's our mom that we can just text in the moment when we're feeling very stressed out. Maybe it's just when we go home and we just get a hug from our partner or from our kids or grandkids. Maybe it's when we just, get home at the end of the day and we're just able to play with our dogs or our cats. And then there's some more long-term things that can really support us with our well-being, that can reduce our stress. And some of that can be just, practicing our kinship, just being in community with others, going to social events, spending quality time with others and making time to do that. Next slide, please. So I think for community, we often think of, physically, the community that we're living in. But sometimes, for us, especially in this virtual world, we can find community almost anywhere. We can find it in our workplace, we can find it online. So defining what community is for yourself, and then not just being a part of that community and receiving from that community, but also how good it is for us for our well-being when we give back to that community. And then just, for us, kinship is such a strong, unique strength in our tribal ways. And so being able to just honor our ancestors, recognize who they are, and how they've brought us to this point in our history, in our lives, and using those kinship terms and just practicing being a good relative. So all of these can be really helpful, just reducing our stress. Next slide, please. So mental strategies, those that you can do in a moment, and then those that you can do, you can develop these habits over the long term. So in the moment, it could just be something as simple as just naming one thing that you're grateful for. Long term, it can be really, as somebody has already mentioned, identifying what those negative thoughts are that you're struggling with, and maybe they repeatedly pop up in your mind, and then replacing them with positive ones. So next slide, please. So I just wanted to share a video quickly that kind of talks about a story that shares about positive thinking and how important that is to us. So can I go ahead and share that, Antonia? Let me know if you can hear the audio. This is just a quick 2-minute video. Oh, it doesn't look like it is working. So what I'll do instead is just drop it in the chat box and you guys can watch it on your own. I'm not sure why it's not playing. But it's just a story of a Cherokee story of 2 wolves, and it just talks about how the one that you feed is the one that is strongest. So I think that really ties into our thoughts. Sometimes it may feel like we don't have any control over our thoughts, but it's really, our intention of helping ourselves build a habit of having positive thoughts and replacing the negative ones with positive ones, and not just stopping the negative thoughts, but having something to replace it with is really what can help us feed that wolf inside of us that is more positive and helpful to us. Next slide, please. So it's really about, we call them cognitive distortions, these unhelpful thoughts that may be troubling to us and that may be as a result of our traumas. And so being able to just reframe them with more helpful thoughts. And, if you're ever, wondering, how come somebody's so optimistic, or how do I have a more optimistic attitude? This is just one way that can help us do that. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, Aqua Ajit Ego is like one example of a positive statement that, I can say to myself, in my own language. This is just a phrase that we are taught and when we're growing up. And so that's something, maybe you have something similar, or just some type of positive statement that you feel like would be a good replacement to some of the negative thoughts that you feel, that you find yourself thinking. Next slide, please. And I'm also going to share a site, and I'll pop this in the chat too. And it comes from Dartmouth, and it's their Student Wellness Center. So you could probably like find apps or something to help you with this, but if you go to this site, let me pop it in a chat for you guys so you can look at it. But it has all of these audio recordings. Some of them are mindfulness recordings. Some of them are visualization recordings, progressive muscle relaxation exercises, and just like soothing instrumental music. So you can just like click on any of these, and they just have all these different audio recordings that you can listen to help you relax. So if you're sitting at your desk, or if you're at work and you're just finding yourself struggling with these negative thoughts, this can be a way to just help you get back on track and just help you calm down. So next slide, please. So just quickly, there's also, some of those emotional strategies, both in the moment and long-term, that you can do to take care of yourself. Next slide, please. And what's important to think about, excuse me. For emotional strategies is just things that you can do to protect yourself, to protect your emotions by setting boundaries or limiting your exposure to things that may harm you emotionally. But there's also just learning to identify your emotions. So tuning into yourself and figuring out what your triggers are. Excuse me. And then there's also the part about regulating your emotions, which is where you want to calm yourself down if you're feeling agitated or triggered by a trauma memory, or just energize yourself if you feel like your energy is super low because of you're feeling stressed. So just finding out ways that are helpful to you to regulate your emotions. Next slide, please. And then the last examples that I'm going to share are just physical strategies. So those you can do in a moment and long term. So, everyone always talks about, having a healthy diet and exercise, and those are things that you can build up to. but just things that you can start doing right now, like, drinking water, practicing your breathing, just different things like that. Next slide, please. So it doesn't have to be, going to the gym. It could just be whatever is natural, whatever resources you have in your backyard. As Nona said, it could just be going for a walk. And then resting, it could be sleep, it could be going on vacation, but it could also just be taking a break, taking a 5-minute break. Next slide, please. And then, we all know there's some movements going on in Indian country that are really important to us, like food sovereignty and the water is sacred movement. Being a part of that activism, being a part of that reconnection to our cultures and our identity and our ways of gathering food and using resources and our relations to these resources, that they are our relatives and treating them as such, those can also be helpful. So it's not just, drinking water, but also recognizing the importance of water to us and how it's our relations to it. Next slide, please. So we practice controlled breathing at the beginning. So this is just something that is meant to help calm us down. So please take that as something. I know it can be weird if you're the only one in the office, trying to practice your breathing, but it really can help calm you down. Next slide, please. Progressive muscle relaxation is another example that can really be helpful. And we'll practice that at the end here pretty quick. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So that's, if Nona or Marilyn wouldn't mind taking over, my coughing fit is out of control right now.
I'm sorry, Veronica. I had you on down low. Can you repeat?
I said, could one of you finish up?
Yes,
Because
I can
my
do that.
coughing fit is taking over.
Sure, absolutely. So just wanting to remind us that an empty lantern provides no light. Self-care is the fuel that allows your light to shine brightly. You can't be a light in the darkness if you're burnt out. Oh, that's funny. So thank you, everyone. We really appreciate you. Please take care of yourselves. The youth need you, your families need you, your community needs you. And thank you for taking the time today. Antonia?
We just shared a link to the evaluation for today's session in the chat. We're really grateful for your input and feedback. It helps us improve our sessions in the future. So if everyone could click on that, it's really quick to complete. And just a big thank you again so much to our wonderful NNCTC team and partners. Really great session today. And thanks again, everyone, for taking time to be here.